For most of human history, we looked at animals and felt nothing philosophical. They ate, they suffered, they died. And when they died, that was the end of it. Not a tragedy, not a loss of anything immaterial, just a body returning to whatever bodies return to. The animal had no soul, everyone agreed. The church said so, Descartes said so, Darwin, the man who would eventually collapse the distance between humans and every other living thing on Earth, wrote it plainly in his private notebooks in 1838, the way you'd write down a grocery list. The soul, by consent of all, is superadded. Animals not got it. No hesitation, no asterisk. He took a note of it and moved on. And then slowly, something changed. Not the animals stayed exactly the same, but we started watching them differently. The crow that remembered faces for years, the elephant that stood motionless for hours over the bones of its dead, the dog that stopped eating after its owner didn't come home and never really started again. We started finding in them something that looked uncomfortably like what we meant when we said feeling, when we said inside, when we said soul. Which means the line we drew was never where we thought it was, which means the question that follows is the one nobody wants to sit with too long. If we were wrong about where the soul began, if the boundary between soulless and unsouled was always blurrier than we admitted, then what exactly were we claiming to have all along? What is it? Where did it come from? Who decided you had one? Here is what I've come to think after spending more time on this than was probably healthy. The soul wasn't discovered, it was built slowly, collectively, over 100,000 years by human beings who needed it to exist so badly. They willed it into reality through language and ritual and the relentless pressure of shared belief until it became invisible, the way all infrastructure becomes invisible, until it felt not like something constructed, but like something simply, undeniably there. You think your soul is the most personal thing you have, it might be the least original. There is a specific kind of 2 a.m. thought that most people have had at least once and then quickly buried. You're lying still or staring in a mirror longer than is comfortable, and the question arises without warning: who exactly is doing this experiencing? Not what you are thinking, not what do you want, but who is the you behind the wanting and thinking, the one watching, the observer of the observation. And for a second, the answer isn't obvious. The self you were certain of a moment ago goes slightly liquid. The center, home, stable, yours, becomes harder to locate, like pressing on something that should be solid and feeling it give. Most people move through this quickly, back to solid ground, back to ordinary things. I want to stay in it because that feeling, that brief disorienting moment of not quite finding yourself when you go looking, is one of the most honest experiences a person can have. It's the moment the machinery shows through, when you catch the soul mid construction and see it for what it actually is before it recomposes itself into certainty again. To understand what it is, you have to go back, not to the beginning. Nobody can go that far, but to the moment the story started hardening into something we'd eventually mistake for truth. It is the winter of 1637, and Rene Descartes is in bed. This is not a metaphor. He genuinely did most of his philosophical work horizontal, late in the morning, in a heated room, while the Dutch cold pressed against the windows outside. He believed this was when the mind worked best, body warm, world quiet, and nothing demanding attention except thought itself. And so he lay there and tried to doubt everything. His senses, unreliable, easily deceived. His memories, reconstructed, distorted, untrustworthy. The external world, possibly an elaborate illusion generated by a malicious demon, whose only purpose was to feed him false experience. He stripped away layer after layer of assumed certainty, looking for something that survived the stripping, something that couldn't be doubted no matter how hard he pressed. What survived was the doubting itself, the thinking, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The one irreducible fact was that a process was happening, and that process required something to be happening in. That something, he concluded, was made of fundamentally different stuff than the body. The body was res extensa, extended substance, material, measurable, subject to physical law. The mind was res cogitans, thinking substance, immaterial, ungovernable by physics, operating by principles that physics didn't touch and couldn't explain. God joined these two substances in every human being at a very specific anatomical location, the pineal gland, a small pine cone shaped structure near the center of the brain. The soul entered there. The spirit touched flesh at precisely that hinge. The ghost settled into the machine at exactly that address. There's something almost tender about the specificity of this. A brilliant man, walking at the outermost edge of what his century could understand, lying in bed in Dutch winter, trying to find the precise place where the infinite becomes personal, the exact door where God delivered you to yourself. He was wrong, but the intuition underneath the wrongness, that something in conscious experience, resists being fully explained by physical processes, that the felt quality of being a self doesn't obviously reduce to neurons firing. That intuition is not as easy to dismiss as his critics wanted to believe, because more than 350 years later, with vastly more sophisticated tools and vastly more data, nobody has fully explained it either. The hard problem of consciousness sits exactly where Descartes left it, slightly embarrassing everyone who assumed science would eventually just dissolve it. He was reaching for something real, he just built the wrong scaffolding around it. I want to show you something that should bother you more than it probably does. The soul doesn't look the same twice. In ancient Egypt, the inner life of a person wasn't a single unified thing, it was a committee. The Ba was something like a personality or character, depicted as a bird with a human head, capable of leaving the body during sleep and returning at dawn, attached to you, but not entirely contained by you. The Ka was a vital force, the animating energy that made you alive rather than merely material. It outlasted the body but required sustenance, which is why the living left food offerings in tombs. The Ib was the heart, the seat of moral weight and intelligence, the organ that would be removed after death, carried to the Hall of Two Truths, placed on a scale, and measured against the feather of Ma'at, a cosmic justice made physical, made weighable. If your heart was heavier than the feather, burdened by a life badly lived, by cruelty and dishonesty, and the accumulated weight of choices that harmed others, it was fed to Amit, the devourer, a creature that was part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, and entirely final. No redemption, no second chance, simply gone. Think about what civilization produces that cosmology. A culture sophisticated enough to understand that identity is genuinely complex, that the self has different dimensions with different properties and different moral stakes. A culture that located accountability not in an abstract spiritual ledger, but in a physical organ that could be weighed, that imagined the afterlife not as a place you entered through faith, but as a threshold you crossed through consequence. I keep thinking about the people who grew up inside that framework, whose entire understanding of what they were, the structure of their inferiority, the meaning of their choices, was built around that image, the heart on the scale, the feather, the creature waiting. That architecture of selfhood existed for 3000 years and is now mostly gone, replaced by other architecture, other scales with different weights, and something about that, the sheer contingency of it, the fact that the entire framework of what it meant to have an inside could have been built so differently and was, produces in me something close to a vertigo, not nostalgia for a dead religion, something more unsettling. The recognition that the self I was handled is not the only self that was possible, that I could have been given a completely different account of my own interior, and I would have believed it just as completely. Now compare this to the Christian soul, singular, immaterial, created by God, internal regardless of what happens to the body, capable of salvation through belief and grace, accountable to a personal deity whose primary orientation toward you is love, not consequence, love. These are not variations on the same idea. They are different answers to different questions asked by different civilizations facing different problems. The Egyptian soul solved specific problems about cosmic order, about what made a life worth having lived, about where moral weight was located and how it was measured. The Christian soul solved different problems about suffering, about equality before a God who saw no hierarchy in humanity, and what made a person irreducible regardless of their social position or material circumstances. Both of them work. That's what I can't stop returning to. Both are functional, both are doing a job, and the job description was written by the living for the living in response to pressures the living needed help surviving. Now, here is the shift, the distinction that actually matters. Consciousness is real. The experience you're having right now, the specific texture of these words arriving, the low hum of your existence running in the background, the fact that there is something it is like to be you at this moment, that is happening, is the deepest unsolved problem in all of science. Nobody can explain where it comes from, why physical processes give rise to felt experience, why there is an inside at all, but its existence is not in doubt. The soul is something built on top of that. The soul is the story we constructed around consciousness, the framework of meaning, significance, continuity, and moral weight that culture placed over the bare fact of experience and transformed it into something sacred, something that persisted beyond the body, something that carried obligations, deserved protections, and connected you to something larger than your own brief life. Consciousness says, there's an inside here. The soul says, that inside was placed there deliberately, and its presence makes you irreducible. You discovered the first one every morning when you woke up. You were handed the second before you could speak. And the handoff happened so gradually, so completely, so early in your life that by the time you were old enough to question what you'd been given, you were already thinking in its language, which makes genuinely stepping outside it not just difficult, but maybe structurally impossible. You cannot examine the framework you use for examining things. I've thought about this for a long time, and I'm still not entirely comfortable with where it leads, which is probably a sign it's worth following. Somewhere between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, human language crossed a threshold it had never crossed before. Before that point, our ancestors communicated about the immediate world, danger, food, social status, emotional states in the present tense. Sophisticated, yes, but bounded. It could point at things visible and present. What it couldn't do was reach inside, couldn't describe interiority with enough precision for another person to recognize themselves in that description, couldn't hand your inner life across the gap between two people and have it land intact on the other side. And then across generations of incremental cognitive development, that capacity emerged. The ability to say not just I am afraid, but I remember when I was more afraid than this, and here is what it felt like from the inside, and here is what it meant to me, and I wonder if it has ever felt like that to you. The moment that became possible, something that had never existed before, entered the world. Not just experience, animals had always had that, but witnessed experience, shared interiority, the inner life that could be handed to another person unrecognized. Two people looking at each other across the darkness and understanding for the first time that the inside of the other one was real in exactly the way their own was real. That recognition was the first act of the soul, not a theological event, not a divine intervention, just two humans at some uncountable remove from us, deciding, without knowing they were deciding anything permanent, that the inside mattered. That decision spread. It accumulated into ritual and story and ethical habit, and eventually into systems of law and cosmology and art, all of them trying to preserve and extend the same foundational recognition, all of them saying in different languages and different centuries, there is something in each person that cannot be legitimately erased. We practiced that recognition until the practice became invisible, until it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a fact, until we forgot there had ever been a time before it. That forgetting is the soul. The soul is like what practice looks like from the inside once you've been living inside it long enough. What it built over time is extraordinary. When you tell someone they have a soul, you are telling them that they matter in a register that cannot be reached by circumstance, not by poverty, not by failure, not by what the people around them have decided their life is worth. Something in them is irreducible. It was there before they earned anything, and it persists after they've lost everything. The idea is the foundation of every moral intuition we have that goes beyond pure self interest. The reason cruelty feels like a violation rather than just an inconvenience is that the soul is real enough to be violated. The reason suffering has moral weight, the reason another person's pain is not just information but a claim on you, is that their inside is recognized as real in the same way yours is. This is what Diderot missed when he dismissed the soul as a useless addition. He thought an invented soul was a deficient soul. He couldn't see that invented is exactly what made it powerful. A discovered fact just sits there. An invented meaning requires ongoing maintenance. It has to be chosen, extended, reapplied, defended. It lives in the continuous act of people treating each other as though it's true. The soul is humanity's longest running collective decision. Sit with that for a second. Not a discovery, not a revelation handed down once and preserved. A decision made and remade every day by every person who looks at another person and chooses to treat the inside as real, which means it can be unmade. Consider what happened historically when powerful institutions decided to act as though certain people's soul were negotiable, not metaphorically, literally, when states and ideologies and economic systems looked at specific categories of human beings and concluded that the interior they carried was either absent or didn't count or could be administratively suspended under the right political conditions. Every time this happened, the horror that followed was not primarily a philosophical problem, it was a human one, and what made it possible every single time was precisely this: someone with sufficient power decided to stop maintaining the collective decision, to treat the soul not as shared infrastructure, but a membership benefit that certain people's kind had never qualified for. The soul being an invention does not make it harmless to remove. Currency is an invention. The rules that make cooperation possible are inventions. Remove them, and you don't reveal some truer, cleaner reality underneath. You just produce a world the people living in it didn't choose and can barely survive. The soul is the invention that told us something in each other was worth protecting, even when nothing practical demanded it. That the inside was real and it mattered in a way that couldn't be cancelled by the political needs of whoever happened to have power this century. We made that up, and then we made it true by living as though it was, for long enough that the living as though became indistinguishable from the fact. The modern understanding of the self, if you take it seriously rather than just nodding at it, is not comfortable. Neuroscience tells us that what feels like unified, continuous consciousness, the stable, coherent, ever present you, is a construction. The brain is not a camera faithfully recording experience. It's a prediction machine constantly generating models of the world and models of itself, filling in gaps, editing the narrative of who you are in real time, smoothing your discontinuities that would otherwise make the self feel like what it actually is, a process, not a thing. Here is a specific version of this that I find hardest to dismiss. Your earliest memories, the ones that feel most foundational to your sense of who you are and where you come from, are almost certainly partially fabricated. Not deliberately, not dishonestly, just reconstructed so many times, adjusted by so many subsequent experiences and conversations and photographs and family stories that the memory you access now bears an uncertain relationship to the event that originally produced it. Neuroscience cannot tell you which parts are accurate, neither can you. The bedrock of your personal history is, at least in part, a collaborative fiction between your past and present self, and there is no way to audit it. Personality, the thing most people feel is most irreducibly theirs, shifts across contexts and relationships and decades in ways that should genuinely trouble anyone who takes a stable inner core literally. The version of you that exists with a closest friend is a different configuration than the version at work, or at 3 am, or in a moment of unexpected loss. Which one is the real one? The answer, as best as anyone can determine, is all of them. The self is not a fixed point, it's a pattern that keeps remaking itself from available materials and insisting on calling the result by your name. And those materials, the language you used to think, the categories you use to organize experience, the values you use to evaluate your choices, the very structure of what it feels like to have an interior, none of that came from you. You were born into a ready made framework. You absorbed it before you were capable of examining it. By the time you could question the framework, you were already thinking inside it. Your soul, the story your culture handed you about who you are and why that matters, was already running before you knew there was a program, before you knew there was a you to run it in. This is where I'm supposed to reassure you, tell you that none of this changes anything, that constructed things are still real, that assembled identities still matter, and I do think that's true. But I think the reassurance misses the more important thing. The more important thing is, if the soul was given to you through language, through culture, through the accident of where and when and to whom you were born, then who you are is partly a function of decisions made without your knowledge by people you will never meet in response to needs that preceded your birth by 100,000 years. That means you are, right now, whether you know it or not, a participant in the ongoing invention. Every time you treat another person's interior as real, every time you take someone's pain seriously, or refuse to reduce them to their function, or simply look at them long enough to actually see them, you are casting a vote in the longest running election in human history. You are choosing to maintain that infrastructure to keep the collective decision alive for one more day. That is not a small thing, it is in fact the thing, the original human act, older than writing, older than agriculture, older than anything we normally call civilization, because it is the fact that made civilization possible. The soul doesn't exist somewhere above this, it exists in this, in the daily, unglamorous, frequently failed practice of recognizing each other. You are not just the product of that practice, you are one of its current custodians, and you didn't apply for the job. So here you are, carrying something you were told was yours, original, intimate, irreducible, the soul, the self, the interior that no one else can reach. And now you know that the language you used to describe it wasn't yours first. The categories you used to understand it came from somewhere. The very feeling that there is a you having this experience, that sense of continuous selfhood, that center you keep returning to, was shaped before you arrived by people who needed it to work in response to pressures you'll never fully reconstruct. The soul was invented because we couldn't afford for it not to exist. That's still true, maybe more urgently true now than it has been in a long time. Which means the question isn't who are you, as if the answer were buried somewhere inside, waiting to be found if you go deep enough and stay honest enough and read enough of the right books. The question is what you're going to do with the part that hasn't been written yet. It only has what you do next.